tell you what,
it's not like the olden days.
I'm Rosie.
I'm Jake.
And this is our podcast on the Disney Renaissance, which, as you may know or recall me telling you on the last podcast, is the films that Disney made between 1989 and 1999 inclusive, so in fact not between. And what had been happening pretty much since the death of Walt after he worked on his last movie, The Jungle Book, was that they'd been getting lazier and lazier and cheaper making their movies, and they ended up with The Black Cauldron, which we have both seen a couple of times, and we discussed how it has a lot of potential which doesn't come close to being realised. So Disney got themselves into some real financial trouble, and they either had to make a really brilliant, mind-blowing movie or go out of business, the way I understand it.
That's why they had to lay off all those animators who Ross and Janice hired for the Chipmunk Adventure, as you were talking about in a very early podcast about.
That's right, but they kept just enough, obviously, to make The Little Mermaid. And before we go into detail about that, I'll just say generally the sorts of things that they were doing to try and relaunch the whole franchise, which was to make something reminiscent of the Disney Golden Age. And I was reading about how they got Alan Menken to compose the songs, for instance, and said that they wanted songs that would stand up alongside Cinderella and Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs. Snow White being the first one, and we could talk for hours about how that's mainly potential and a lot of trying things out and not all of it working, but we won't do that because there's too much else to talk about. Cinderella, I do agree, is a very strong one. And also, they actually bothered animating it properly, and when you read the credits, it says for each of the characters, lead animator and things like that, and they've put a lot of effort into creating fully fleshed out characters who are well written, well voiced, and well animated, whereas before they were reusing bits of animation. The characters all looked very much the same. They ended up looking really rather rough. I think you could see some of the construction lines in things like, say, for example, The Rescuers, which I'll come back to briefly as a film, and using any old voice actors, it strikes me. I think they had a sort of bank of voice actors who they just get for any old role.
And they still do a lot of good work, of course, but they weren't carefully selected and cast to play each individual character like they were during the Disney Renaissance, and that really does show through.
Yes, and that's another thing that was happening in the Disney Golden Age. I read lots of very interesting things about how Walt would snatch up the right voice actor if it was the first one he saw, or audition hundreds and hundreds of actors and actresses before he found the right one.
It's a well-deserved moniker, the Disney Renaissance. It definitely did save Disney in many ways and does contain lots of excellent filmmaking and several excellent films. And like many things from our childhood, we were lucky to be around when that was at its best, and we were able to enjoy watching quite a lot of it in the cinema and on video, and we still do to this day.
The Little Mermaid was one that we watched on video a lot, wasn't it? Instead of buying the video, we used to get it out of Blockbuster all the time, or possibly even Ritz before that, because it was good fun to go to the video shop and get some sweeties and a film to watch, and we got the same film out of there more than once, not just The Little Mermaid, also Little Women and Milo and Otis.
I was very interested to read at one point that The Little Mermaid was the last ever Disney movie, or until The Princess and the Frog, it turned out, to use hand-drawn cells. And I wanted to get this out of the way now as something I wanted to say, and it's not really hugely important, but it is a thought that occurs to me when I watch the Disney movies, that sometimes there are animation sequences in the movies after The Little Mermaid that are mostly about showing off what they can do with their computers, like an extended flying through the cave sequence in Aladdin, which looks very video game-ish, and all the Beauty and the Beast dancing and shots up to the ceiling and things, very much showing off their graphics. And that could be annoying if they weren't included in very good, high-quality, entertaining movies. But fortunately, they are. And that's why it's not really worth mentioning, but I've mentioned it here now to get it out of the way. I said the same thing about The Iron Giant when we did a podcast on that. A lot of that is showing off, ooh, look what we can do with our computers. And actually, it's true of The Mummy, the animated series in places. But all those things I enjoy so much for all their good points and their excellent quality, production and acting and everything, that it doesn't matter at all. Although computer graphics for the sake of computer graphics showing off on their own, trying to carry a whole thing, can be, and frequently you see them being nowadays, very annoying.
One thing we noticed when we watched The Little Mermaid recently, yes, that's all right for people in their 30s to watch that, was that it's very well structured. One of the ways in which they engage you as an audience is using structure. It opens with a ship on the sea, something we can relate to. And have you heard the myths and legends about mermaids?
King Triton must be in a friendly mood. And you think, oh, we'll meet him.
And then down we go into the depths of the sea, down and down and down and down they take us, and then it's very striking, isn't it? The mer people swimming into shot, and there's the underwater kingdom, and they do something very clever with the score. I don't know the technical terms, but the music sort of swells, doesn't it? And the choir start all going, oh, and that kind of thing.
And you realise, it's mer person's song all along. Here are the mer people.
And then we meet Triton and Sebastian, and they're all like, where the hell is Ariel? She's supposed to be singing in the concert. And then we go and meet Ariel with Flounder, and she's the protagonist, of course. See what she's up to, see what drives her, what motivates her.
What really struck me about The Little Mermaid when we watched it most recently, as well as the structure, because we had a little chat about that, and it's very true, but I was moved to remark that Sebastian, Flounder and Scuttle were such an excellent trio of support characters, friends for the protagonist, for Ariel, and I don't think they were ever bettered, even by Lumiere, Cogsworth and Mrs. Potts, who are going to be my second favourite little things helping the protagonist, but Sebastian, Scuttle and Flounder are my absolute favourites, and they all play different roles in the movies and help Ariel in different ways, and are all very strong characters on their own and as pairs and as a trio, and I think that's a winning formula they found in that Disney relaunch movie that's been successfully used again in other movies, but never quite equalled with the actual characters themselves.
If I may just refer back to Snow White, this is relevant. The DVD edition of that I have has a commentary by Walt Disney, and you're like, how the hell? It's bits of recording of him talking about Snow White that they've got together over the years, and he talks about why he chose that story, and the archetypal characters that he felt he could work with, the villain, the romance with the protagonist, and the funny little man kind of characters. And you see that throughout the Disney Golden Age, particularly in the fairy tale ones, Cinderella's mouse friends and a couple of other animals, although the mice are the only ones who speak. And it's the three fairies in Sleeping Beauty, isn't it? So they realised that was part of the winning formula, having those funny, goofy, yet very valuable and supportive sidekicks, allies for the protagonist, and as you say, that carries on with Lumiere and Cogsworth and Mrs. Potts and Abu and Carpet, who doesn't say anything or even have facial expressions. But then as it's gone on, often those characters have got kind of annoying, haven't they? Like in Bolt. That hamster, God, it's annoying.
And then if we look back to the slump at something like the Black Cauldron, you see that the stupid thing with the stupid voice and the pig don't really cut it with the potentially very compelling, likeable, heroic protagonist in that. It's called Tarzan, isn't he?
Yes, he is. He's part of the potential, along with the Horned King, the villain, but then the rest of the cast and what actually happens and the way the whole thing pans out, it just doesn't work.
But in the Disney Renaissance, yes, as I was saying, even though they don't reach the heights of Sebastian, Scuttle and Flounder, you do get very successful ones. You mentioned the ones from Beauty and the Beast and Aladdin. Timon and Pumbaa, I mean, they're very good in their way. Even in Pocahontas, I think they get away with it, with the dog and the raccoon.
And the hummingbird.
I think perhaps the gargoyles in the Hunchback of Notre Dame is where it starts to go slightly askew.
Getting back to the Little Mermaid, of course, it has that character structure, doesn't it? We've talked about the sidekicks, we've talked about Ariel, of course, she's having the romance, and you'll hear people now like Keira Knightley saying, oh, it's anti-feminist, you mustn't ever give up your voice for a man, and I don't disagree with them. It's not just him, it's the whole world above that she's drawn to, but of course he is the catalyst, the last straw that makes her say, I've got to do this. His name is Eric, of course. There are other characters too who you can add to that basic structure. In Cinderella, there's the king, the Grand Duke, the ugly sisters as kind of sidekicks to the villain, the love interest, whoever. And you get Triton, a couple of people in Eric's palace, Grimsby. And of course, the villain, she has her sidekicks too. And I think she flops them in Jetsam, who I used to find actually rather frightening when I was a child, more frightening than Ursula herself. The minions who come and get you with their creepy hypnotic eyes and their creepy voices. I was actually quite scared of them.
I can't think about them without saying, poor child, poor sweet child. Very manipulative. They only have that one speaking scene in the movie, but it's very important, very atmospheric and very good.
I think they're eels, aren't they?
Yes, they're electric eels.
They sort of twist and writhe like the biblical snake, tempting Ariel to do the bidding of evil, but of course her father, who's supposed to be on her side, is so unhelpful and shouty. Who can blame her? Getting back to Alan Menken, I think he certainly did his job with the songs along with the lyricist. Howard Ashman, Part of Your World, very iconic Disney princess song. Poor Unfortunate Souls, iconic Disney villain song. Kiss the Girl and Under the Sea, brilliant, very memorable, very catchy, and certainly do stand up with A Dream is a Wish Your Heart Makes and Someday My Prince Will Come and Whistle While You Work and whatever. And the whole fairy tale theme and Alan Menken and all that kind of thing and Disney Princess and stuff carries on into the Disney Renaissance. But first, they make The Rescuers Down Under, and I said I was going to come back to The Rescuers. I'll just say very briefly that I've read the book The Rescuers by Marjorie Sharp and was interested to see the film when I was younger, and I've seen it again more recently, and it's nothing like the book, but it's quite engaging. It's in the Disney slump a bit. I think they get together a good voice cast. I think it's one of the better ones that isn't actually one of the really good ones.
We know all about how you bought that from the Turtles podcast.
Oh yes, of course. And also, in 1989 they'd been making Chip and Dale Rescue Rangers. So these factors combined, we've been doing Rodents Who Rescue. I remember The Rescuers, that one wasn't bad, was it? Or do you think we can get back the original main two voice actors? Yes, we can. We can't get back the guy who was the voice of Orville the bird, probably because he was dead. We'll have to get someone else, and it could be his brother Wilbur. And actually, one of the things that make The Rescuers engaging, in my opinion, is those two lead characters, Bernard and Miss Bianca. And I watched The Rescuers Down Under quite recently. If you really want to know, there was a 3 for something or other deal on Disney DVDs on a website, and I got the double pack of The Rescuers and The Rescuers Down Under as one of the 3, so I got 4 Disney classics, so that was good. And you might wonder what's really the point of making that one after The Little Mermaid. It's not in the soup as much as the others. It's not this whole let's make Disney brilliant again thing. And I thought to myself, perhaps they've gone back to one of their old films, made this sequel to try out their computer graphics, get together with Pixar, who you can see in the credits way back then. And having watched it, I think that's probably about right. I think it's not quite as good as The Rescuers, which, as I said, isn't one of the really good ones. It's okay, it's reasonably engaging. The actors come back and do a very good job. Of course, the character designs are very different. They look very polished and shiny and neat compared to the rather rough, cheap animation from the Disney slump.
Interestingly enough, it's the only sequel actually in the list of official animated Disney classics, isn't it? So I guess it had its place and its time and its importance, and that is recognised.
That's why it was the only double pack I was willing to get for my Disney collection too. So I'm quite glad I got that. The other ones I got were Up, a more recent one, and one we're going to talk about later, so I'll save that for a surprise. And there were a lot of kind of flying sequences and sweeping landscape and mountain sequences, which is probably a lot to do with why they decided to set it in Australia. And of course they have a lot of exotic animals down there. And what I did find very interesting was that the characters, particularly the animals, have their own very particular expressions and movement, which we hadn't seen for a long time. Before The Little Mermaid, and I suppose The Jungle Book could be the last one where they really tried to make the animals reminiscent of the real thing. And what I found most memorable was Joanna, the salamander, and she had a lot of character, I thought. She's the sidekick to the villain, who's this big game hunter who's trying to manipulate the little boy into taking him to where he can kill this giant eagle. And Joanna's helping him, keeping guard over all the other animals he's got locked up and climbing down narrow passages and things to get things for him. And all she wants to do is eat eggs, and no matter what he's trying to get her to do, she's always after eggs to eat. And she doesn't talk, but she makes sort of noises, and there is someone doing her voice, and she makes these faces behind the man's back, and you can very clearly tell how she feels about him. She's got these salamander scuttly movements, and I enjoyed watching her, and I thought she was a very successful test of their CGI and an example of what you can achieve that's going to enhance the experience of watching the film, rather than just, hey, wow, look at this cool flight sequence we can do.
Beauty and the Beast was the first film we ever saw in the cinema.
Continuing the big blockbuster fairy tale revival here.
We saw it with our mother and our grandmother, and we went to McDonald's first and had Mrs. Potts in the Happy Meals and then watched the movie in the cinema, and I thought, hey, this is great. This is a very fun activity that we've never done before with our mother and our grandmother, and we've done a heck of a lot of fun activities with them. And it led on to a series of watching Disney movies in the cinema in Hatfield, as well as other things we liked, such as Jurassic Park.
I have to say, I don't remember getting Mrs. Potts in the Happy Meal. I must have got that and thought, what the hecky-decky is that? And then found out when we watched the film. But what I do remember is I hadn't been to the cinema or really realised there was any such thing as a cinema. And I was saying, what are you doing, Mummy? And she was saying, we're going to watch a film, darling, and all that sort of thing.
That's interesting, because I knew the concept of what it was, but I hadn't been.
So in we went. I thought, I wonder if I'm going to enjoy this. I hope it's not a boring film. And obviously we would have had to sit through lots of music and adverts for Cocoa Pops and cars, and then previews, and then the film's about to start, and it comes up Walt Disney. And I thought, oh no! And if you've listened to our Warner Brothers podcast, you will know that that's because whenever we sat down to watch a 5-minute cartoon and it said WB presents, I think, hooray, Bugs Bunny or something. And when it said Walt Disney, I thought, oh no, Mickey Mouse or something. And I had no idea Disney had done anything other than stupid, boring, annoying, baffing, anthropomorphic animals to silly diddly music. And I thought, God, am I going to have to sit through that for the length of a film? And then it started, and it's that whole intro, principles, cruel, selfish, and unkind, or whatever it is. I thought, okay, that's quite interesting. And then who could learn to love a beast? And then out comes Belle, and they do the song and everything. And I forgot all about Mickey Mouse. I was quite engaged. And as the film went on, I was absolutely blown away. And I thought, hey, this is really good.
I love Beauty and the Beast for sentimental reasons of the first trip to the cinema, and remembering how much I enjoyed it at the time, and I think it is a very wonderful film, very wonderfully done. As I say, I like the three lead household objects, Lumiere, Cogsworth and Mrs. Potts, but they're well backed up by a whole other cast of similar servants and or enchanted objects. And I enjoyed all the main human characters who were human all the time, Belle and Maurice, and I could see why Gaston was funny and evil and cowardly and also dangerous. And I thought it was just an absolutely wonderful film overall, and I still do.
I was just wondering, could you make a case for Gaston being the first Disney villain who's an ordinary human who just happens to be evil? Of course, there is that big game hunter in The Rescuers Down Under, although he goes around acting very evil the whole time and very sinister. But it's certainly different from the kind of thing Walt used to do. Of course, Lady Tremaine in Cinderella is a regular human, but it's very quickly made clear to us that her true nature is cruel and selfish and unkind, whereas Gaston really is introduced as one of the townspeople.
And of course, one of the supporting characters is one of those very good, immersive child acting performances that I like, which was Bradley Pearce's Chip the teacup. You can see him in person a couple of years older in Jumanji, and I was particularly struck by that when I saw the trailer for Hermione and the Beast, the live-action Beauty and the Beast, and heard Chip in that, and it sounded like a really bad voice acting guest performance on Thunderbirds Are Go, and I thought, wow, how I yearn for Bradley Pearce, which is a microcosm of yearning for the whole original movie, really. And next it was Aladdin, which we also saw in the cinema and enjoyed very much, and still do to this day. I used to think about Aladdin, well, it's a bit contrived and convenient, the wrap-up. Of course Jasmine has to say, I know why you did, I forgive you, let's go ahead and get married and stuff. They haven't really addressed Aladdin and his lying to her properly. But then quite recently, within the last couple of years, when we were watching it, I suddenly clicked and got it and thought, oh, right, Aladdin and Jasmine have been on exactly the same journey of lying about themselves to themselves and to each other, and they've both helped each other have this journey of self-realization and come together as a couple. So of course she knows why he did, and it makes perfect sense, and thematically and structurally, and for the characters and their ship, it makes absolutely a lot of sense, and it's really very beautiful and well done. So I finally got Aladdin properly. A similar thing happened when we were watching Dirty Dancing within the last 5 years as well. I get them eventually, you see.
Aladdin is another one that struck me as being particularly well structured. Beauty and the Beast is as well, but I've never turned around and said, hey, this is really well structured, like I have about The Little Mermaid and Aladdin. I've noticed recently some films are very by the numbers, and you can tell they've got it from some sort of writing frame and some screenwriting class where they've been told this is how you structure your movie. That's not a good structure. It has to take you 10 or 20 years to notice if it's a really effective structure.
The trouble with the structure of Beauty and the Beast, of course, is that it leaves LeFou in disguise as a snowman outside Belle and Maurice's house for the whole winter, and there's actually a whole insert movie there, Beauty and the Beast and Enchanted Christmas. No wonder it was so blue when Belle finally did get home. So yeah, perhaps Beauty and the Beast scores slightly less on structure points than some of the others, particularly Little Mermaid and Aladdin.
With the more Western fairy tales, I quickly learned that you can't worry too much about Disney not being true to the original. They certainly put their own spin on all the stories. I think Cinderella's probably the most like Charles Perrault's version, although they do add bits to use up the time. And at one stage I read the story of Aladdin from the 1001 Arabian Nights, and it bears very little resemblance to the Disney movie. Jake and I were watching it recently, and I said, oh, this is much better than messing about trying to make windows out of rubies or whatever, and he didn't know what I was talking about. I seem to remember that's one thing that happens in the original.
Does the original bear more resemblance to the traditional Aladdin pantomime with the Chinese stuff, the laundry, the new lamps into old, that sort of thing?
Yes, and the Genie of the Ring.
Ah, yes, that as well.
It does indeed. So with that one, they really took a basic premise and made a whole different story out of it, but I think they did it really well.
They made a whole new world out of it.
And I was just going to talk about the songs, Alan Menken again, and he won Best Song and Best Original Score Oscars, both for more than one film, certainly Little Mermaid and certainly Aladdin. I'm not sure about the others, but there were some. And A Whole New World is one of my favourite songs ever, and that one has lyrics by Tim Rice, because while Howard Ashman was working on Aladdin with Alan Menken, he died. I'm afraid I don't know why. I never bothered reading about it, but it means that some of the lyrics in Aladdin are by him and some are by Tim Rice, and I think thereafter Tim Rice doesn't really come back, so whenever they wanted Alan Menken, someone else was the lyricist, and I'm not going to be able to tell you who.
It must have been quite a sad, premature death, Howard Ashman, I think, because it's dedicated to him. He was only about 40.
Yes, moving on from that, getting back to what Disney were up to, it shows how they were planning their movies quite a few years in advance. The Little Mermaid was only just out, and they'd been working on Aladdin. And speaking of singing, of course, Beauty and the Beast was the last one in which everyone did, so Aladdin is the first one in which everyone does not do the acting and the singing. And I've sometimes wondered why that is. The lad doing the speaking voice of Aladdin, he's so cute. I've seen him doing his voice recording in a YouTube video. He's really sweet and he's got a lovely voice for Aladdin. I thought, is it because maybe they wanted him so badly and he's not really a singer and he's so young? And they get a good sound alike with Brad Kane. Lee Salonga does the singing voice of Jasmine. I know their names because I've seen them written down whenever I've listened to A Whole New World. Or is it nothing to do with that? And you were saying, as we were discussing it amongst ourselves, they seem to think thereafter, even though there's usually some main character doing his or her own singing, they need to get singers rather than actor/singers to do the big numbers of the protagonists. The main love interest is usually who they are, the boy and the girl. And I said, oh, well, not always. I wasn't being contrary. I was simply stating a fact. For instance, Quasimodo does his own singing. Meg, the girl in Hercules, does her own singing. So sometimes they do get a singer/actor. But Hercules, in that young Hercules, doesn't do his own singing. Grown-up Hercules doesn't do any singing. And Esmeralda doesn't do her own singing.
Yeah, you do get a few of them, don't you? Big musical numbers for the leads, with singers specially hired to do them. Can You Feel the Love Tonight in The Lion King, for example. God Help the Outcasts in The Hunchback of Notre Dame.
Go the Distance, that's Hercules' one.
Colours of the Wind in Pocahontas. That's the big one she does, and she's the only one in that movie who doesn't have the same actress singing and talking.
Her other song is Just Around the River Bend, which is quite a big one. And the other song I can think of, I can't remember the name of it now, but all the sailors and John Smith, Mel Gibson doing his own singing, and doing a big all-together number about their hopes and dreams, and they're all their actors, and Pocahontas never sings with any of them, she only sings on her own.
And it was interesting how we spotted in the credits, with Aladdin, they didn't particularly want us to realise. They had the voice by Scott, something or other he's called, and then later in the list of the songs it goes performed by Brad Kane, and you think, they're sneaking it under our radar. And they do the same thing in The Lion King. But then later, with Pocahontas, they finally admit, here's her voice, here's her singing voice. She's part of the main cast, which is nicer to credit the singers in that way and not lie to us or slightly mislead us anyway about it.
Again, we were speculating about why they'd done that at that point, and sometimes there isn't really a reason for these things, is there? And that's just the way things are, is the best explanation. But we did speculate and said maybe she's such a famous singer round her way and they wanted her so badly, she said, well, I'll only do it if you put me in the main cast. That could be true, it could be absolute rubbish, who knows?
We certainly don't. But one person in Aladdin who does do his own singing, because he's so talented, or he was in many, many ways, was Robin Williams. And we're not hugely going over every cast member that we like in these movies, because we like all of them, or most of them, and that would take forever. But Robin Williams does provide something very special in his performance as the genie, as he does in most of his performances. And how he'd hate me for picking him out for special recognition, because he didn't want his name all all over the publicity for Aladdin and was very cross when Disney used him in that way to sell the film. And he only came back to do the third movie, the second sort of TV movie sequel, Aladdin and the King of Thieves, when they apologised and gave him $1 million. And then he said, okay, I'll come back and dub over Dan Castellaneta and be the genie one last time. But he is absolutely wonderful with his acting and with his singing and with the way he brings the part and the movie to life. And it's not that he overshadows the wonderful voice acting of young Scott, whatever he was called, who's so wonderful, and Gilbert Gottfried as Iago, who's so amusing. But he is, Robin Williams, always worth special praise. So there it is. And sorry, Robin in heaven, for singling you out like that, but you did deserve it.
And we've mentioned The Lion King, which was next, wasn't it? And I've got a slightly interesting story about that. It's probably not very interesting, really, but we did see it in the cinema, as per tradition, and get the toys out of the Happy Meal. But after I'd seen it, my best friend at the time was going to go to see it with her mum and me and our other friend for her birthday. And we got there, and we were all excited, and someone in an Odeon cinema uniform came and said, oh, the screen's busted or something was wrong with the projector or something and they weren't showing it today. So we had to all trail home terribly disappointed, and the birthday treat was rescheduled, and then our father, whom I think we've mentioned before, turned around and said, no, you can't go to that, I've got everyone tickets for Sooty in London, or was it the Alden Arena, which didn't even have Matthew. So I wasn't very happy about that. So I was supposed to see it in the cinema twice, once with my friend, but I missed out on that experience.
The Lion King was the last one I saw in the cinema at all, and the same isn't true of you, but it was 1994, the summer of, a year that had a lot of changes in our lives for various reasons, and I was 11. I was starting to think, oh, perhaps I'm growing out of these Disney movies, and the next year I didn't feel I wanted to go and see Pocahontas or anything after that. But objectively, watching them as an adult, I do think The Little Mermaid, Beauty and the Beast, Aladdin and The Lion King are actually in a league of their own in terms of all the things we like, characterization, structure, songs. So I didn't choose a bad time to start thinking I don't want to see them in the cinema anymore. And I hadn't watched The Lion King for quite a few years when we sat and watched it on DVD, when we were having a bit of a watch through recently. And I was very glad I had watched it again. Obviously it's unbearably emotional.
God, I cry buckets whenever I watch it. It's impossible. And it's not one of those ones where you're allowed to move on and forget it after it happens. It's with you through the whole of the rest of the film. It's terrible and wonderful.
But as I discovered, yeah, it is well worth the trauma of watching it. It is very well structured. The characters, voice work, songs, they are all up to the standard of the movies that come just for it. I never really thought about how the role of Mufasa actually allows James Earl Jones to do a lot more interesting acting than we normally hear him do. He's usually just turning up with his very distinctive voice and saying things in his very distinctive way that are quite generic things when he's being the old man of the mountain in Sam Neill Merlin, when he's being Darth Vader. But actually the role of Mufasa had a lot of depth, and the relationship with Simba was quite carefully plotted, and I think it allowed him to shine through as a diverse actor, as I don't really associate hearing him being given the opportunity to do.
I think it was Robbie Coltrane from Hell who first made me think it's not the character who dies, it's the character who cares. And that's because Johnny Depp was dead, and I thought, oh, I'm not bothered really. And then Robbie Coltrane came along and reacted, and I suddenly broke down. But certainly Simba with the corpse of Mufasa, which probably went on to get eaten by the hyenas, didn't it? Confirmed that in a big way for me. What a moving performance.
Oh yes, and Jonathan Taylor-Thomas as young Simba could certainly go up there with Bradley Pierce and other great voice acting performances. I was particularly enjoying the scene he was doing with Jeremy Irons as Scar. Hey, Uncle Scar, and being all young and enthusiastic, and you're really weird. And it made me remark, oh dear, what a shame Scar isn't content to be in the beloved favourite uncle role in Simba's life, because Simba's giving him this great opportunity to do it and wants wants to have Scar in that role, even though Mufasa hates him. But no, that wasn't enough for Scar.
Well, he is a lion, and actually lions do that, kill the main male and his offspring and take over.
And of course the interesting factoid that was floating around about The Lion King at the time, and it's true, is that it was the first Disney animated movie not directly based on some written source material, although, as has been pointed out, it does draw some inspiration from Shakespeare's Hamlet.
I saw a YouTube video once as well that was telling me it's basically just this Japanese cartoon from the 70s or something about a little lion cub. But we all draw inspiration from something that exists when we create a story, don't we?
It's like we were saying about Bram Stoker and his original Mummy novel, The Jewel of Seven Stars. That may be where we basically get the start of what turns into other Mummy movies, The Mummy Secrets of the Magi, but it's going to have been drawn from other source material, and the same is true of Bram Stoker's Dracula. It's a genre-defining vampire piece, and yet it draws from certain other things, like that interesting book Carmilla that you got hold of.
Of course, if you watch The Lion King and you feel upset, to cheer yourself up, you can go on YouTube and find the Animaniacs parody of, first of all, the opening sequence, Circle of Life sequence, and also the Death of Mufasa scene.
All done with tigers very, very well.
The Tiger Prince, it's called. And then, as you said, it was Pocahontas, and I did want to go to the cinema and see Pocahontas, and Mummy took me and fell asleep and snored, which was very annoying. And that was my, gosh, parents get old and annoying moment, I think. And at the time I enjoyed it very much, although I wouldn't like to say why. I do think not only is it not up to the standard of those previous four, it's also not quite so good as the following few.
3, certainly, I would say. That's up to Mulan.
And possibly 4, which we'll get to. So I don't really want to say anything about that, except thought Mel Gibson was pretty good. Oh, I wanted to mention Rowan Atkinson as well on The Lion King. He's very famous for doing screen performances, particularly as Mr. Bean, but I thought his voice performance as Zazu was top-notch as well.
He does particularly well maintaining that character during the singing, bringing down Simba in the I Just Can't Wait to Be King song. Very well done by Rowan Atkinson.
I suspect some of that was added on and ad-libbed when they were playing it back and filling in, like when Zazu's falling over the waterfall and he goes, ah! I think Rowan Atkinson would have seen that in order to know how to make that as funny as possible. So I tried to talk about Pocahontas then. We came back to The Lion King, and we've already mentioned the songs and the singers.
When we watched Pocahontas recently, I made a couple of remarks that you told me were exactly the same remarks I'd made when we watched it before, so they must be how I really feel. But I do think the structure is lacking. It's a bit all over the place. You can't really map it out in your mind what happens and when and follow the character journeys through. And also the songs have aspects of just singing the plot, singing what's going on, singing how the characters are feeling at that time, singing Should I Marry Coco? And songs like that do annoy me, just singing the plot. So those two things certainly, I think, put Pocahontas rather at the bottom of my list of favourite Disney Renaissance movies. But I do like it.
I'm pretty sure that's still Alan Menken, but we can't blame him for the lyrics, can we? Perhaps it was a lousy lyricist they got to help him that time.
We've talked about Jim Cummings quite a lot in the podcast, and we were noticing how he was doing a lot of additional voices in all these Disney Renaissance movies. As I said when we first talked about him, he really has been in everything over the past 30 years or so. But one thing I noticed in Pocahontas was that Jim Cummings was doing all the singing for the Indians, the two kind of grown-up men Indians anyway, singing in a kind of Indian voice that didn't really match the two Indian actors who were doing them. But certainly a talent of Jim Cummings there, and not his only talent. Of course, he had quite a main role in The Lion King as Ed the hyena, who doesn't say a great deal, but adds a great deal to the hyena trio as a trio, and how we were enjoying Whoopi Goldberg and Cheech Marin as Shenzhen Bonsai as well, particularly Whoopi Goldberg being very funny. we're really sorry.
Yes, great big lion threatening to kill them for attacking his cub. Like, we're really sorry, he's gonna cut it. She's excellent, Whoopi Goldberg, isn't she?
None of these movies would work without the right voice work, and certainly they've got it.
Next came The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and I did go to see this one in the cinema, and I think our mum was getting bored of it by this point, so I had to go with our father. And I don't remember him specifically ruining that outing for me, so I guess he just complained about the price of Maltesers and then we got on with it. But I did come back and say to our mum, I didn't enjoy that one as much as the others, and she said, oh, you've grown out of Disney then. And I thought, oh, right, well, that must be it, but perhaps I shouldn't have been quite so quick to accept that that was what it was. Although it may have been part of it, I've enjoyed it more coming back to it, and I've enjoyed Pocahontas less than The Hunchback of Notre Dame, and at the time I enjoyed my Pocahontas experience more, so perhaps I was in a bit of an age of not believing.
Yes, it's a mix of personal experience linked in quite closely with your age and the actual subjective quality of what you think of the film with adult eyes and ears.
I do still think The Hunchback of Notre Dame is missing something, but it's hard to put your finger on what. I think all the voice performances are top-notch, or as close as you can get with the material they're given. We laughed out loud when Esmeralda was dancing and Tony J was saying to Phoebus, using a mix of actors and characters here, just look at that disgusting display, and he goes, yes, sir. That made us chuckle. And Demi Moore as Esmeralda, very good. Tony J, excellent. I can't remember the name of Quasimodo's actor, but he's Mozart in that film that our music teacher used to make us watch all the time, and you know his name.
Yes, I do. I think the performance of Tom Hulce as Quasimodo is very good, very sensitive. That was a word I used to describe the performance of Mason Vale Cotton from Desperate Housewives as Arnold in the Jungle movie, and all the ripping into the Jungle movie we did was well deserved, but we both thought that Mason Vale Cotton did give a very sensitive performance as Arnold, and I think Tom Hulce gives a similarly sensitive performance as Quasimodo, makes you care about him, makes him seem like a vulnerable, caring, emotionally abused, loving person. And of course, he's a music person as well, Tom Hulce, and that's why he was hired to play Mozart, because he had to do playing the piano and singing and that as well, or humming at least, anyway, musical stuff. And he's an excellent mix of a very sensitive voice acting performance and a strong singing performance. I've always been struck by how well cast Tom Hulce is as Quasimodo.
And you were talking about the characterisation there, and I think the world of The Hunchback of Notre Dame is very interesting, and the characters are very interesting, and it has quite a lot of differences from the Victor Hugo novel, but it's the same basic story with the same characters, just a bit toned down in terms of the sex and violence and death.
Like you always say, Tony J, whose voice pops up adding a lot to things like Extreme Ghostbusters and Hey Arnold, proper Hey Arnold, does an excellent performance as Frollo, really very evil, really very sinister.
So what is it that's missing? I can't say. Just that indefinable something extra, I suppose.
It was interesting when we watched it this time and found out, or were reminded, perhaps we once knew it, that it was written as historical fiction. It was written by Victor Hugo in, the 18th century?
Possibly 19th.
But it was actually set way back in medieval times.
14-something, I read.
When Notre Dame Cathedral itself was quite new. And it was very interesting that in it was featured the Court of Miracles, which is something I get very interested in when we watch the BBC Musketeers adaptation. The slums of Paris that were subjected to urban regeneration in the sort of 19th, 20th century. And I was saying, The Hunchback of Notre Dame, if it's set in like the early 19th century, must be the tail end of the Court of Miracles. But actually, it charts the beginning of the Court of Miracles, the kind of haven of the gypsies as it is in the Hunchback, and it grows into this kind of immigrant community that, like Cabrini Green or whatever in Chicago, descends into a den of vice and iniquity. So it's quite interesting, I thought.
I haven't read the book all the way through. It's too long and difficult for me, but I read the interesting bits. Quasimodo gets whipped. That doesn't happen in the film. He just gets fruit thrown at him. Esmeralda gets tortured with a thing called the boot. That doesn't happen in the film. Quasimodo actually hits people and kills them in agony with his molten lead. In the film he does that, but it doesn't actually touch anyone. And I found it interesting that more often, or as often as the term gypsy, those people are referred to as Egyptians, which is where the term comes from. I thought that was very interesting indeed. Again, it's Alan Menken, and I do think he's running out of catchy tunes. The songs aren't very memorable, with the exception of Hellfire, but I think that's got a lot to do with Tony Jay's performance.
I remember from the monster in my pocket cards about the Hunchback, it said he poured molten lead on his victims. I thought, seems a bit random, but when you see it in context in the Hunchback of Notre Dame, it made perfect sense.
And the cathedral has a lead roof, of course. That's how he has access to the lead.
And we're not really talking about sequels, but I did like in The Hunchback of Notre Dame sequel direct-to-video when we watched it a few years ago, how Quasimodo did find himself a nice, pretty woman to be his soulmate, and the young voice-acting performance of Haley Joel Osment as the son of Esmeralda and Phoebus was rather engaging too, I thought, so it's better than most Disney sequels, I think.
Of course, in the book, pretty much everyone dies, and Esmeralda is killed by Frollo, and Quasimodo starves to death cuddling her corpse, so they had to change the ending for the Disney film, didn't they? And I did think at the time, oh, okay, so love is only for attractive people. I think that's a bit of a shame.
It's interesting how Frollo is the Archdeacon of the Cathedral in the book, isn't it?
Yes.
And they change the Archdeacon of the Cathedral to a different character in the film, but he's kind of Frollo's conscience, isn't he? Frollo's going to do something evil, and every time the Archdeacon turns up and says, "You cannot do this, God will not forgive you," and Frollo thinks, "Oh God, perhaps I've gone too far." And then finally, when Frollo says, "Get away from me, you old fool," and ignores him, that's where Frollo goes completely over the edge and needs to be plunged into the fire.
Speaking of which, I do like to see Disney villains fall to their death, because it always looks very reminiscent of, and therefore I think is certainly an homage to, the original Disney movie villain death. The evil queen in Snow White and the Seven Dwarfs falls off a sort of rock thing and gets followed down by the vultures. Very atmospheric, one of the really good bits of Snow White. Although I don't think it happens as much as that in the Disney Renaissance, does it?
It happens to Gaston, it kind of happens to Scar, but the hyenas really join in. He falls off the cliff first. So yeah, we're really due one with Frollo, and we get a good one. Hercules was the next one, and I didn't see that until after I'd seen and enjoyed Mulan. I think Mulan opened me up to the possibility that, maybe these late 90s ones are okay, actually.
I think you and I watched Hercules at the same time. It came on TV one Christmas or something. We said, let's give that a go. I seem to remember I didn't like it that much the first time I watched it. And then I got it on DVD and we watched it, and I still thought, well, it's not as good as other ones. But then when we watched it most recently, I realised it is one of those really well-structured ones. I think a lot of what I thought had to do with James Woods, who a lot of people find hilarious and love his comedy performance. It just doesn't speak to me, so I did find that a bit annoying for the main villain. But everything else works very well.
You mentioned the big musical number earlier, I Can Go the Distance, and that was sung by a special singer they brought in as the singing voice of Hercules, young Hercules, and this was something I looked up after we'd watched Hercules recently and got very indignant about on behalf of Josh Keaton, who of course played Jules Brown in Back to the Future, the animated series, and I mentioned in the Back to the Future podcast how Josh Keaton also played young Hercules in Hercules. Whenever I've watched Hercules, I've thought, yes, that is a very good, strong, young voice-acting performance as young Hercules. He's got quite a bit of work to do. Hercules is trying to find his place in the world, interacting with other people, interacting with Zeus, the god, his father. And I think Josh Keaton did that very well, very sensitively too. And it made sense to me that they had hired Josh Keaton for this role, because when you look him up, it says he is an actor, voice actor, and musician. And I thought, yeah, that makes a lot of sense. They've hired a young musician and voice actor to play young Hercules, as they should have done. But then you read the end cast and you see that Josh Keaton didn't do his own singing. And you think, what the hell? What is the point of hiring a talented young voice actor musician if you're not going to let him do his own singing? So I was so outraged, so moved by this, that I trawled the internet for a while and found a blog post by Josh Keaton from a couple of years ago that explained the whole thing. And of course he had been hired to voice and sing young Hercules. He did record I Can Go the Distance, but they decided his voice was too pop and had it redone. And I think that's horrible treatment of poor old Josh Keaton. And it turned out from this blog post that it was in response to someone asking him a question about why have you been redubbed as Spider-Man in certain things. And he was saying, well, sometimes they find a voice isn't quite right. They have to redub certain bits, recast certain bits. I'm grateful for the work. And I think poor old Josh Keaton, he keeps getting redubbed. But as we've explained before, he's actually a very talented voice actor. Well, I'm telling Mother, and I've heard his singing and I liked it. So I think he's been trodden on once too often.
From that blog post, it seems to happen to Josh Keaton more than average, although it does happen to actors a lot, including Dan Castellaneta, as we were saying earlier.
Yeah, that's true. Poor old Dan Castellaneta did all the genie dialogue for the animated series and The Return of Jafar and The Prince of Thieves, King of Thieves, and then, whoops, don't need you, we're going to record over you with Robin Williams.
I think if it's time to move on to Mulan, we saw that one at the same time as well before Hercules for whatever reason. Not in the cinema, certainly not on video. It must have come on TV.
Yes, it was on one Christmas.
And I liked it a lot. And I think of the ones that aren't your big four, which I do agree with you about, it is the best one. Perhaps even it could be counted among them if it wasn't missing the sentimental and nostalgia aspect. I don't know. But it's a very good film. Very fun, very engaging, very thought-provoking, very well structured.
Quite sinister and scary in places with the Huns. The little girl will be missing her doll.
Oh goodness, yes. Standout voice performance, or certainly the one that one remembers, is probably Eddie Murphy as Mushu.
The first time I watched it, he did amuse me quite a lot. When he randomly does his Batman impression, that made me burst out laughing. Your worst nightmare. And he's very much cutting his teeth for Donkey on it.
Yes, he is. Again, like with Zazu, when I was watching recently, I thought, oh, Eddie Murphy's watching this bit and ad-libbing. They're all falling off this cliff, being pushed over by this massive avalanche, and he's saying, we're gonna die, and all that kind of thing, and they're going over the edge. He says, no way, we survived this. And I thought, you wouldn't think of that if you could see it.
He does the same kind of humour that works so well when Keenan does it, and would work really well saying things like, I know the T-Rex is here, I know it's a T-Rex, I got velociraptor blood in my mouth.
I see twins from the Shining, that's why I'm gonna pass out.
But fortunately, not enough of those are Eddie Murphy or Keenan.
Or Regina Hall. Good songs as well. Reflection, classic Disney princess song. Interestingly enough, Warwick Davis was doing his game show Tenable, getting the contestant to list the first 10 Disney princesses. And I thought of Pocahontas, although she's by the standards of our culture, less a princess than most of the other ones. She is a chieftain's daughter.
She's the same kind of princess as Zia from the Mysterious Cities of Gold.
And then in between her and Tiana, there was a gap, and I was thinking, gosh, who could it be? And I narrowed it down to Mulan and Meg from Hercules. And I decided to go with Mulan because Hercules is very stylized, and I couldn't see Meg standing with all the other princesses on the merch. And I was right, Mulan is an official Disney princess.
Even though she's not a princess by any stretch of the imagination.
No, her father's not a king, and her love interest is not a prince.
I like the line from the Emperor in the exciting climax of that movie. Quite stereotypically Eastern knowledge, I suppose, the kind of thing that Lin Cho may have said to Alex O'Connell. No matter how the wind howls, the mountain cannot bow to him. I think that's something we should all bear in mind in our lives. No matter how much people are peeing us off, we must be true to ourselves.
There are lots of little touches throughout I like as well. Shan, the main guy, has got activity with an arrow to prove a point, as you were saying, like Arden Bay. And just as Mulan's about to give up and go home, having been sent away for being rubbish in the army, she finds a way to complete the activity, and then that's used later on once she is revealed as her true self, as a woman and a soldier and a warrior.
Yeah, that's very clever bit of structure. It's quite nice, really. It's better than Ardeth Bay's arrow analogy, but Ardeth Bay is the worst teacher in the history of the world. He gives you the two weights that you have to have on your arms while climbing the pole that appear to be hindrances, but actually they are part of the solution, like your negative parts of yourself or your parts of yourself that need to be improved, taken under control, can actually be used positively as well to bolster your whole personality and skills. It's a bit like what we learned from the recent Disney Pixar movie Inside Out, about emotions mixing together to make your whole self.
And thinking about that scene reminds me of an amusing line by one of Mulan's friends, contemporaries in the army, when he's told to go and get the arrow. I'll get that arrow, pretty boy, and I'll do it with my shirt on. It's very funny the way he says that. And then I'm reminded of how Mulan has two trios of allies, sidekicks, amusing people helping her out. There's Mushu, her horse, and the cricket as one, and then Ling, Chin Po, and the guy I just quoted, and he's the one whose name I can't remember. But they're great because, obviously being guys, they first have to fight with Mulan, posing as Ping, to make friends, because that's what men do, and she's very surprised by this. She doesn't think that's how you make friends. And then they accidentally end up having a bath together, and she's trying to escape, so they won't notice she's a woman, and they make friends, and then they're friends in the army. And then when she is revealed and Shan is going to cut her head off, the three of them rush forward going, no, 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 because though they're surprised and shocked to discover that she is a woman, they're still her friend. And then after she's been left behind and they've gone off to try and sort things out, and she discovers there's going to be an ambush, goes to join them in the Chinese capital. She's there in her women's clothes, not her silly women's clothes that they make her dress up in for the matchmaker, her natural clothes that she's comfortable in. They're breaking down the door with a battering ram, and she's all like, there's not enough time, I've got an idea, come on guys, and they drop the battering ram and go after her, and I love that bit.
I always thought that was very effective because officially they're supposed to have abandoned her, a woman in the army, she's been exiled, sent on her way, but she says she's going to sort it out. They jump to action because they know it's the right thing to do, they trust her. They are quintessentially a true and effective family.
Of course, that made us talk about good friends and bad friends in Disney, didn't it? Pocahontas has a really bad friend who just tells on her to cocoa her. Oh, she's gone off with John Smith. And I could look past that if she thought Pocahontas was in any danger, but she really didn't. So that's a bad friend. Those three guys in the Chinese army, good friends. Another good friend in Disney is Lottie, Charlotte LaBeouf in The Princess and the Frog, for various reasons. But when we go on to talk about the next film, Tarzan, which I think is probably now, we can tell you about a very bad friend.
I'll tell you who else is a good friend, just briefly first. Nala in The Lion King. I liked the way when Mufasa had turned up at the elephant graveyard and being overly cross with Simba, Nala says to him, well, I thought you were very brave. It just goes to show you get better emotional support from a good friend than you do from your parents, probably.
And of course, Tarzan's best friend is also one of his fellow creatures, Turk, the gorilla, voiced by Rosie O'Donnell when she's older and a couple of little girls when she's younger. And I don't remember much of what she did because we've actually only seen it the once, and now it's the time to reveal that was my third DVD in the 3 for however many pounds offer. But certainly she shuns him when they're growing up and she wants to play with the other gorillas, and she tells him, you can't play with us unless you go and get an elephant hair, thinking that he will slink away and not bother them, which is bad friendship anyway, but actually it gets him into really serious trouble in she doesn't even confess that she had anything to do with him annoying the elephants.
If they learned something from that and built their friendship up from it, that would work, but she's just terrible all the way through.
Later on, she doesn't do anything particularly to show herself a good friend. I think she gets cross with him instead of supporting him at one stage. I need to watch it again, really. But then when things are getting emotional and all that kind of thing, she's all like, oh, I'm his best friend. And we're like, are you? The elephant who he befriended, Tanto, voiced by Wayne Knight, whilst stealing his hair as a child, is a better friend, I think.
I thought it was very interesting to finally watch Tarzan, and I thought it was a good film. I thought Brian Blessed, as usual, did an excellent voice performance. He always does an excellent voice performance, even when you can see his body as well. As the main antagonist, we weren't quite sure what he was planning or how and when he was going to do it, but we knew he was up to no good, and then it really all came to a head quite effectively.
The problem was that the gorilla who died was Kerchak, who was such a bad friend, father figure, tribe leader to Tarzan that in order to try and make us care, they had to get Robbie Benson's soundbite of the beast saying, "Came back," which doesn't even really make sense in the context. He dies, and because he's no Mufasa by any stretch of the imagination, we simply don't care. Of course, that's better than Kala, or Kayla, I can't remember how they pronounce it, his mother dying.
His relationship with his adopted mother was quite well done, yeah. As I was saying when we watched it, he achieves the sad but unusual feat of losing 3 parents in one movie, but he's still got one, his adopted gorilla mother, and yeah, they had a good relationship. It's quite effective when he's saying to her, no matter where I go, no matter how human I become, basically, he doesn't spell it out like that, you'll always be my mother, even though you're a gorilla and I'm not.
Yes, that's a very effective scene. She's shown him his parents' treehouse that they made for themselves before they got eaten by the leopard.
Yes, she understands things like what is a shipwreck and what is a photograph, and I believe that of gorillas.
And then he's coming out of the treehouse and he's like in shadow, and then he walks into the light and he's got his father's clothes on, having had a loincloth, and we were saying if it was real he'd be naked, weren't we? But I read the book very recently after we watched the film, just the original. I've yet to read The Return of Tarzan, which I think some of the basic story is also based on. And in that, Tarzan is naked for most of his childhood, but then he discovers his parents' hidey hole and their books and their pictures, and he realises that he is a human being, the creature that's in the pictures, and that they will cover up their personal area. So he's got his loincloth before anyone finds him in the book. And there are some other interesting things to compare. I read his mother's name, his gorilla mother's name, as Kala. Maybe they said Kayla in the film, I can't remember, but she actually dies fairly early on. Up to that point, the relationship between them is very close and loving and touching, and it's very sad when she dies in the book, and I'm glad she didn't in the film, and I thought that translated very well into Disneyfication. But then reading the book, it turns out Kerchak is far, far worse than he is in the Disney film. He leads an expedition to see what the humans are doing there and kills Tarzan's biological parents. And he kills a couple of other people too. And in fact, he's responsible for the death of Carla's baby that she's had, which makes her have those maternal hormones and milk and things and want to adopt Tarzan. And we did say, when we were watching the film, that we thought it was a bit unnecessary for her to have had a baby that dies, which does happen. It's that damn leopard taking away the child of Carla and Kerchak.
And that's reminded me how I was interested in how Kerchak was the only one of the gorillas who knew what humans were, what a gun was, and the repercussions potentially of that for the troop of gorillas that he was now in charge of. And that was his motivation for doing and saying and thinking and feeling what he did in the movie. However, I do think they took him too far and made him too unreasonable. They had a good reason there for us to sympathise with him. Oh yes, he knows the danger from those people, from those guns, and he's just trying to protect his tribe. If he'd been a bit nicer about it, that would have worked quite well, and we'd have cared when he was dead.
A scene I did find very striking was Tarzan proving himself by killing that darn leopard and making his noise, his triumphant roar. And I thought after that, Kerchak should start to get on with him, accept him, like him, be a father to him, but he didn't. I haven't talked much about the human characters. You mentioned Brian Blessed. In the film, his name is Clayton, which I think I would have forgotten if it hadn't struck me reading the book that the name was taken from Tarzan's parents, and in fact, John Clayton is Tarzan's real name. And he does what Brian Blessed does, goes around shouting, throwing his weight around, wanting to capture and display gorillas. And he's got his gun, and Tarzan's learned to mimic the sound of a gunshot, and we were saying, he doesn't know what that means yet. That'll be a moment of revelation for him. I thought they could have made more of that, actually, partly by having Kerchak be less of a git, as you were saying. But obviously, in the end, Clayton has to die, and he does actually fall out of a tree and ends up getting strangled on some vines. And we were saying, well, what's the point of that? That's not poetic justice. There's been no precedent for this. Why didn't he just fall? But again, it's something that's taken from the book. Just as a bit of homage, Tarzan is very savage and kills with cause, but without much thought, like animals do, and he does so by finding out that he can make lassos out of creepers and things in the jungle, so I guess that's why they did it. But how many children know that? So it seems slightly pointless, a bit of an Easter egg for people who have read the book. Then of course there's Jane. Very famously, Tarzan's girlfriend is called Jane. Me Tarzan, you Jane. I was trying to find out if that line ever actually was in a film, and apparently it wasn't. It was just people doing parodies in their stand-up comedy and stuff. But in any adaptation, you'll see that scene, Jane, Tarzan kind of thing, where he rescues her from some sort of marauding beast, and then they become acquainted, and that's in the book. And I thought Jane's performance was pretty good. And whenever you've talked about people sounding like they're being crap in Thunderbirds I'll Go, I thought, goodness, it's usually English actors. What is it about English actors? Can I think of any who've done good voice work? And I do think back to the original proper Watership Down movie. And then I started to think, oh, they're all men. And I think, well, it's because they asked men to do this kind of acting more than women. They've had more opportunities. But Minnie Driver as Jane, I think I could very reasonably use as an example of a British woman doing a good voiceover. And there's only one other human character that I can remember, and that's her father, Dr. Porter, her name being Jane Porter. And I could give you all sorts of comparisons about them in the book and the film, but it would probably get a bit boring, except that in the book, Dr. Porter's a sort of comedy character and says the sorts of things an academically intelligent but socially rather clueless dad professor would say, and they probably would have done that sort of thing with the character anyway, being Disney, but it does translate very well from the book.
And there we are. Many thoughts about the Disney Renaissance and perspectives of how and why we like it and where we think it falls short, which isn't nearly so often as some other things we've podcasted about so far. Hopefully you'll join us again next time, which will be the final Sunday in April, for a podcast on a BBC sitcom, which we've done a few of now, and it's one we've mentioned a few times and promised we will come to, and the time is now imminent, Fawlty Towers. So until then,
good night out there.
whatever you are.